She stood at the edge of the track, her metal brace glinting in the morning sun, the whispers around her too loud to ignore but too familiar to flinch at. Amina had long since learned how to hear past them, but that did not mean they stopped hurting. "Is she really going to run?" someone muttered. "This is going to be sad," said another. Their laughter was not loud, but it was sharp, cutting in the way that only casual cruelty can be. It was field day at Martin Heights High School, a day meant for team spirit, games, laughter, and friendly competition, a day that students looked forward to for weeks. But for Amina, it had always been different. She had cerebral palsy. It did not define her, but it shaped the way she walked, moved, and was seen. She was used to being left out, used to sitting in the shade while others ran, used to hearing that it was for her safety or comfort or well-being. And yet somehow, this year, she had been asked to participate, not just in any event, but in the sprint. At first, she had been excited. Maybe something had changed. Maybe the school was finally ready to see her as an athlete, not a patient. But that hope evaporated the moment she saw Coach Willis's smirk as he announced the exhibition sprint. The label said it all. It was not a competition. It was a display, a gesture. She was not being invited to prove herself. She was being set up to be pitied. She could have said no. Her mother had told her that gently while helping her adjust the brace the night before. "You owe them nothing," she had said. But Amina was tired of living on the edge of things, tired of being looked at but never seen. So she nodded and said yes. And now, here she stood, in lane 4, under the gaze of the crowd, with every step ahead of her a declaration. The other racers had been told to hold back. Coach Willis had said it in a half-joking tone, but everyone knew he meant it. "Let her have her moment," he had said, like she was an aging celebrity being honored at an award show. Amina had heard him. Every word. She stood still as he approached her now with his clipboard tucked under one arm, sunglasses perched on his head. "No pressure," he said with that same smile. "Just give them a good show, a jog, maybe a few steps. The crowd will love it." Amina looked past him, her eyes fixed on the finish line. "Thank you," she said. It was not gratitude. It was permission to stop talking. He stepped back, and the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Now presenting our special exhibition sprint. Let's hear it for Amina Karim." Scattered applause. Polite, uncertain. Amina felt the texture of the gravel beneath her shoes, let her fingers curl and uncurl at her sides. Her heart thudded, not from fear, but from focus. She had practiced for this, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because she refused to be reduced to someone's photo opportunity. The whistle blew, and she moved. Her first steps were slow. Her left foot dragged slightly before finding rhythm. Her brace clicked against the track. The other runners hung back as told, watching her out of the corners of their eyes. But something about her stride was different than they expected. It was not effortless, it was not graceful, but it was committed. One foot, then the next, then the next. Not fast, but steady. A hush began to fall over the crowd. Laughter faded, phones lowered. Amina kept going, her eyes locked on the white line ahead. She could feel her muscles strain, feel her balance shift with every step. But she kept moving, not limping, not crawling, running, in her own way. At the halfway mark, Jules, the fastest sprinter in the school, glanced toward her, and something in his face changed. He was not watching a pity race anymore. He was watching a competitor. He stepped forward, slowly at first, then faster. One by one, the other runners joined in. They began running, not ahead of her, but beside her, not to outpace her, to honor her pace, to match it. When she crossed the finish line, she was not alone. She was surrounded. The crowd did not erupt. They stood, quietly. A few began to clap, then more, until the field was filled with applause, not for the school, not for inclusion, but for the girl who had turned a setup into a stand. Amina looked up. Coach Willis was still holding his clipboard, his face pale, his smile gone. She did not speak. She did not need to, because every person in the bleachers had just seen something they could never unsee. After the race, the crowd dispersed slowly, almost reluctantly, as if stepping away from something sacred. No one spoke to Amina at first, Not because they did not care, but because they did not know how to. She had shattered their expectations without even raising her voice. Teachers glanced at her with new eyes, unsure whether to congratulate her or apologize. Coach Willis stayed near the equipment table, pretending to jot notes on his clipboard, though his hands shook slightly with the weight of what had just unfolded. Jules approached her first. No fanfare, no crowd around him, just a quiet presence beside her as she sat on the edge of the track catching her breath. "I think that was the most real moment I've ever had on this field," he said. Amina turned her head slightly toward him, the sun behind her making it difficult for him to read her expression. "Thanks for not running ahead," she said. He shook his head. "I did not hold back. I caught up." That made her pause. No one had ever said something like that before. Not about her movement, not about her ability. She had always been made to feel like people were slowing down for her, waiting out of pity, pausing out of obligation. But Jules had said something different. He had not changed his pace for her. He had changed it with her. There was a difference. That afternoon, the race became the only thing anyone talked about. Students who had barely acknowledged her in the hallways now whispered her name like it carried a new kind of power. Some approached her awkwardly, unsure of how to say they had underestimated her. A few just gave her a thumbs up in the hallway. One girl from the drama club left a note in her locker that read, "You gave us something real." Amina read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the side pocket of her backpack. At home, her mother had already heard the story. Someone had sent her a video. They watched it together that evening on the couch, the volume turned low, the sound of the crowd in the background soft and unimportant. What mattered was the way Amina's face looked, focused, fearless, entirely her own. That night, she lay in bed replaying every step of the race. Not the part where she stumbled slightly near the finish line, not the way her brace had pinched her calf halfway through, but the moment she realized the crowd had gone quiet. That moment when silence was not about awkwardness, but reverence. She had never felt that before. The next morning, an email arrived in her inbox. It was from Principal Dawes, short, director. He asked to meet with her that afternoon. Her chest tightened. Was she in trouble? Had someone complained? Had she done something wrong by not sticking to the show? When she arrived at the office later that day, she found him standing beside the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned and smiled in a way that did not feel rehearsed. "Amina," he said, "I want to apologize." She blinked. "For what?" "For letting the people in charge of Field Day treat your participation like charity," he said. "You were not invited to compete. You were used, and then you turned it into something powerful." He walked back to his desk and sat down. "I want to do something different next year. I want your help." She sat down slowly. "You want me to help plan Field Day?" He nodded. "I want it to be inclusive, genuinely, not for show. I want kids like you, not just with disabilities, but anyone who gets overlooked, to have a voice in how these events work." Amina stared at him. "You are serious?" "Very." She exhaled. "Then I will help, but only if it is real." "It will be," he said, "because you made it real." Over the next few weeks, Amina met with teachers, students, and volunteers to draft a new model for student athletic events, one that included adaptive races, non-competitive relays, and awareness workshops. It was not perfect. Some students rolled their eyes. Some teachers asked if it was too political. But slowly, things changed. And somewhere between the meetings and the planning sessions and the lunchtime brainstorming circles, Amina realized something else had changed too. Her name had stopped being whispered. It had started being spoken, with respect, with admiration, with weight. And she was not just being seen, she was being heard. For the first time, she was not moving through a school that merely tolerated her. She was building a school that reflected her, that honored her speed, her story, her stride, one step at a time. By the end of that semester, Amina was no longer just a name on an attendance sheet. She was a presence. Her classmates, even those who had once ignored her completely, now listened when she spoke in class. Teachers began calling on her not just when they needed a symbolic voice, but when they wanted insight, clarity, or leadership. Her life had not magically become easy, and her disability had not disappeared. The brace still chafed some mornings. Her gait was still uneven, but now when she walked down the hall, her steps carried authority. Something else shifted too. Jewel. What had started as a nod of respect on race day turned into longer conversations. They met during lunch sometimes, just sitting under the bleachers while he ate and she sipped tea from a thermos. They talked about books, about teachers, about the strange ways people tried to define you before they even knew you. Jules confessed that he used to resent expectations. Being the fastest runner came with assumptions about how he should behave, who he should compete with, what he should care about. And then you showed up, he said once, and you were just raw, unapologetic. You made me remember why I started running in the first place. Amina did not know what to say to that, so she said the truest thing she could think of. I run because people keep trying to make me walk. They both laughed. It was the kind of laughter that settles into your chest. Quiet, shared, real. Word spread about the inclusive field day plans. Amina was asked to speak at a district meeting for student leadership, where she presented her redesign ideas in front of a row of administrators in navy blazers who all took notes like they were listening to a keynote speaker, not a 16-year-old girl with a steel brace on her leg. Afterward, one principal came up to her and said, I have never thought about sports this way before. Amina thanked him, but inside she thought, maybe it is time you did. The more people listened, the more she realized they had never really meant to leave her out. They had just never been taught to include her in. She was teaching them now. Spring arrived with unexpected momentum. The new field day was scheduled for mid-May, and buzz about it had taken over the school. For the first time, events were designed with students like Amina in mind, not around them. There were races that rewarded perseverance instead of speed, relays built around trust, not timing. One event was even designed by Amina's workshop group, a team-based game where partners had to communicate without words, a nod to inclusion across abilities. As the day drew near, something strange began to happen. The students who had once shrugged off field day as just another break from class were now invested, not because they wanted to win, but because they wanted to participate. Amina watched it unfold like a slow sunrise, warm and impossible to ignore. Teachers who had never worked together were collaborating on heat maps and timing sheets. The student council offered to print accessible flyers and rework the announcement scripts so that every name would be read with intention. Even the cafeteria staff got involved, preparing a special post-event meal that included dishes from the cultural backgrounds of the event's student leaders. But there was one moment that stood out above all the others. A week before field day, during a lunch period, Jules found Amina in the library and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. It was a sign-up sheet. She unfolded it slowly. It was a relay race, one of the new inclusive formats. Jules had written both their names in the first two slots. I want to run with you, he said, not because it proves anything, just because you are the kind of person I want beside me. Amina stared at the form, her chest tight. Then she looked at him. You are sure? I have never been more sure of anything, he said. So she nodded. Then we run together. On the morning of field day, the field looked different. Not just physically, though there were new ramps, wider tracks, and shaded spaces for cooling breaks, but spiritually. There was an energy in the air that felt less like performance and more like purpose. The games began, the laughter returned, and for the first time in school history, every student participated. Every single one. Some walked, some rolled, some ran, and all of them were seen. When it came time for the relay, Amina stood beside Jules, holding the baton with both hands. The crowd was already cheering, not out of novelty, but because they wanted to see what would happen. Amina took her place. Her brace tightened. Her heart raced. She looked forward, not to prove anyone wrong, but to run beside someone who had chosen to believe in her. The whistle blew, and she moved, not alone, but as part of something bigger. The baton felt cool in her palm, slightly worn from the other heats that had passed through it, but firm, solid in a way that reminded her of her own body. Not perfect, but unbreakable. Jules gave her a quiet nod as he moved to his position ahead. Amina stood in lane 2, surrounded by voices calling her name, not mockingly, not politely, but with genuine encouragement. She could hear someone from the journalism club narrating into a recorder. And now we begin the inclusive relay, featuring the one and only Amina Karim leading off. The words fluttered against her ears like wind through tall grass. She focused on her mark. Coach Willis stood by the sideline, no clipboard in hand this time, just a look of humbled respect. It was the first time he had watched her as a runner, not a symbol. That meant something. The starting whistle blew, and she launched forward, not fast, not smooth, but determined. Her stride was uneven, but every step had been trained, rehearsed, and willed into existence. The track seemed longer than usual. The curve came too soon. Her brace caught slightly in the dirt as she rounded the bend, but she powered through. She could hear the crowd swelling, shouting her name, clapping, cheering with something real behind their voices. Not pity, not shock, pride. When she passed the baton to Jules, he caught it cleanly and took off in a burst of practice speed. But he did not run to erase what she had done. He ran to honor it. When he crossed the finish line with the final runner of their relay, the entire team gathered in the infield, out of breath, grinning like children on the first day of summer. They did not win by time, but that did not matter. They had done something bigger, something longer lasting than a trophy or medal. They had set a new tone, one where competition did not come at the cost of compassion, where strength was measured not just in muscle, but in courage. As Amina stood catching her breath, someone placed a ribbon in her hand. She looked down, confused. "It's not first place," said the teacher with a smile. "It's recognition, for leadership, for bravery, for changing the conversation." She held it gently, not because she needed the ribbon, but because it represented something no one had ever given her before: acknowledgement without strings. After the event, a quiet buzz followed her everywhere. Students came up to her in the cafeteria, in the halls, even on the bus home, just to tell her what the race had meant to them. One girl, someone Amina had never even spoken to, burst into tears while explaining that her younger brother had a disability and had never thought he could play sports until watching Amina race. That girl was now starting a petition to create a permanent adaptive sports program at the school. Amina hugged her without words. That moment said enough. The next week, Principal Dawes invited her back into his office, not to congratulate her this time, but to ask her something. "Have you ever thought about speaking beyond this campus?" he asked. "What do you mean?" she replied. He leaned forward. "There's a statewide youth leadership summit this summer. They are asking for one student from our district to speak about inclusion and systemic change in education. I think you would be perfect." Amina stared at him. "You want me to speak for the district?" "You already are," he said. "This would just make it official." She took a deep breath. It was one thing to run in front of a crowd. To speak to them, to be their voice, was something else entirely. But then again, she had already run a race that was not meant for her and made it her own. Maybe this was just another kind of track. A few weeks later, she stood on stage at the summit in front of over 500 students, teachers, and administrators from all across the region. Her leg brace was freshly adjusted. Her notes were folded in her palm. But when the moment came, she did not read them. She spoke from memory, from truth, from the place in her chest that still remembered standing on that field months ago, believing she had been invited only to fail. "Inclusion is not an event," she said. "It is not a theme day. It is not a hashtag. It is a practice, a discipline, a commitment. And if you only include people when it is convenient, you are not including them. You are managing them." The room went silent, and then they rose. Applause filled the air, long, sustained. Students from different schools lined up afterward to meet her, to thank her, to ask her how they could do more. And Amina stayed, answering each question, shaking every hand, taking pictures not as a celebrity, but as a reminder of what representation looked like when it was not about performance, but about presence. When she got back home, she collapsed into her bed, her phone buzzing with messages from students she had never met. Each one started the same way. "You made me believe I could." She stared at the screen, then closed her eyes. The race was still going. Only now, others were running too. Summer came quickly after the summit, But Amina's world did not slow down. If anything, it expanded. What began as a race meant to humiliate her had become something larger, an opening, a ripple. And now, the ripples had turned into waves. Local reporters began requesting interviews, not the sensational kind that asked about inspiration or framed her story as tragic. These were real conversations. They asked her about policy, about access, about structural gaps in how schools serve students with disabilities. One journalist asked her what it meant to be seen. Amina answered with something she had only recently put into words. Being seen is not the same as being noticed, she said. You can be noticed for all the wrong reasons. I have been. Being seen means someone chooses to recognize your full capacity, your limits and your strengths, without rewriting your story for their comfort. That quote ended up published in 3 different newspapers, and it sparked something unexpected. A city council member reached out to her directly and asked if she would join a youth advisory board on inclusive education. At first, Amina thought it was a mistake, a formal government email addressed to her asking for her input on real policy, but it was no error. Her name had traveled, her message had been heard. She accepted, cautiously. The first meeting took place in a sleek building downtown, with polished floors and chairs that creaked under nervous teenagers and overconfident adults. Amina brought no entourage, no speaking notes, just a notepad and a pen. As introductions made their way around the table, she listened carefully. Most representatives were older. Several were already running nonprofits. Some had spoken at conferences. One boy talked about his startup that helped teachers monitor attendance through artificial intelligence. Amina said none of that. When her turn came, she simply said, I am here because someone once tried to use me as a decoration, and I refuse to be quiet about it. The room fell silent for a moment. Then, one by one, people began to nod. She had said what many had danced around, and it landed like truth always does, with quiet authority. Outside of meetings and interviews, Amina's world stayed grounded. Her friends remained few but strong. Jules visited often, usually with snacks and long walks that turned into deep talks. They did not label what they had. They just existed in it. Something tender, something honest. They trained together when the weather allowed it. She still ran, even though there were no medals waiting at the end. Running had become more than an act of movement. It was a declaration, a routine, a way to remind herself that every inch gained was hers. Some mornings were hard. Her legs stiffened in the night. The brace would leave red marks. Some days the noise of attention became too loud, and she missed the quiet anonymity she used to live in. But when those days came, she remembered the first time she stood on that track. She remembered the hush before the whistle, the silence after the finish line. And she kept going. In late July, her school hosted a summer event for incoming freshmen, a kind of orientation disguised as a celebration. Principal Dawes called her and asked if she would come speak. She hesitated, not because she did not want to, but because the auditorium still made her heart beat a little too fast. It was where she had once been laughed at, but it was also where she had been seen. So she said yes. When she walked on stage, she wore her old field day shoes, not out of nostalgia, but as armor. She spoke not about herself, but about space, about the importance of building rooms that let everyone breathe, about making decisions that did not just accommodate, but invite. She told the story of a race that was never meant to be hers, of a coach who underestimated her, of students who laughed, and of how she had run anyway. Sometimes, she said, what starts as humiliation becomes transformation, but only if you refuse to sit down when they expect you to. She did not expect applause, but the room stood anyway. That moment was not loud, it was full. And as she left the stage, she knew someone in that crowd was holding on to her words like a rope in the dark. That was enough. That was everything. The girl who had once been forced to run as a joke had now become the reason others were stepping forward. One voice, one race, and now a movement. By late summer, Amina was beginning to understand something she had not expected. Change was not just about big moments. It was about persistence, about follow-ups, about systems. Her time on the advisory board introduced her to a very different world. Policies moved slowly, meetings repeated themselves. Well-meaning adults sometimes listened with half their attention, but still, she showed up. At one meeting, the topic shifted to sports funding across public schools. Amina asked a simple question: how much of that funding includes adaptive equipment or accessible training spaces? The room went quiet. One district official checked their notes and answered vaguely, "We will have to look into that." Amina held her ground. "If you have never looked into that before, then you are not funding athletics. You are funding exclusion." That sentence made its way into the meeting minutes, then into a city education newsletter, and finally into the inbox of a local senator. A week later, she was asked to attend a roundtable with other youth leaders on inclusive funding. She almost declined. She was tired. The race had never really ended. It had just changed lanes. But when Jules heard she was thinking of sitting it out, he showed up on her porch with a backpack full of lemon soda and trail mix. "You do not get to stop now," he told her, "because the rest of us are still trying to keep up, and we need you leading the way." She sighed. "You make it sound like I know what I am doing." He smiled. "You do not have to know. You just have to keep moving." So she went, and what she said at that round table would echo for months. "I do not want my name on a banner. I want it written into budgets. I want it reflected in ramps, in training, in staff. Visibility is not a favor. It is a responsibility." After that, things moved faster. She was invited to a statewide education panel. Her name appeared in an article titled "The Reluctant Leader Who Changed the Race." The irony was not lost on her. She had never wanted to lead. She had only wanted to be seen, but now somehow her example was doing both. And then came a call that stopped her mid-step. It was from a major sportswear company. One of their outreach directors had read about her work, watched clips from her summit speech, and wanted to sponsor a short documentary, not just about her, but about access in youth sports. Amina froze when she heard the offer. Jules was the first person she told. They met at their usual spot behind the library benches where the concrete was cracked, but the breeze always came through. "A documentary?" he asked. "That is huge." "I know," she said, "and I am scared. I do not want to become a headline. I want this to stay real." Jules leaned back. "Then make it real. Be the one who tells the story your way." That night she stayed up late writing. Not a speech, a list of names, of students she had met through her work. The girl with a stutter who choreographed dances with headphones on, the boy who used a wheelchair and taught himself how to shoot free throws without help, the twins who had been told they would never be fast enough to run track, until Amina helped them redesign the baton handoff for shorter distance relays. These were the people she wanted the camera to see. When the film crew arrived 2 weeks later, she welcomed them in with clear terms. "This story is not about me. It is about what is possible when you stop building programs around the loudest voices and start listening to the ones you have never heard." The crew followed her through classrooms, gymnasiums, backyards, and weekend clinics. They interviewed students, parents, teachers. They captured more than footage. They captured the texture of a movement. When the documentary premiered online, it was 34 minutes long and titled "Run With Me." Within the first day, it had over 50,000 views. By the end of the week, it had reached 100,000. It was shared by advocacy groups, reposted by celebrities, discussed in education forums, and quoted in student newspapers. Amina barely kept up with the messages. Some came from other countries. A teacher in Brazil wrote, "Your story helped me convince my school board to start an adaptive sports program." A girl in Japan messaged, "I showed your race video to my classmates. Now we are redesigning our school's sports day." A mother in Canada sent a picture of her daughter, 6 years old with leg braces and the biggest grin Amina had ever seen, running in a park. But the message that made her stop completely came from an unfamiliar email address. It was short, just a few lines. "Amina, I was one of the students who laughed that day, at the first race. I did not understand then. I think I do now. I am sorry. Thank you for not quitting. Because you did not quit, I started to care." Amina read it 3 times, then closed her laptop and walked outside. The air was warm. The sun dipped low. She sat on her porch steps and let the world spin for a moment. Not because it overwhelmed her, but because she finally understood something simple. Her race had never been about speed. It had always been about permission. the permission to be different, to demand space, to refuse the smallness others offered her. And now, others were asking for that same permission, and she would give it again and again, not because she had to, but because someone always needed to hear it. You are not a decoration. You are not a guest. You are the reason the track exists in the first place. Autumn rolled in quietly. The trees on Amina's street turned golden, their leaves forming a soft carpet over the sidewalk, where she often walked with Jules after school. But this season was different. Amina had always loved fall for its stillness, its gentleness, but now the stillness felt temporary. The world was watching, not just her school, not just her city, but far beyond. The documentary Run With Me had been featured on a national education platform. A television producer had reached out. A scholarship foundation had called, asking for her to speak at their youth summit in the spring. At first, Amina said no to everything, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she needed to pause. She had created something powerful, but it had grown larger than her, and for a moment, she was afraid of being swept away by it. What if the world only liked her because of the headline? What if they were applauding the story, but still unwilling to change their systems? Then, one evening in mid-October, she received a letter. Handwritten, tidy, slanted letters across a soft cream envelope. It was from her old gym teacher, Miss Anaya, who had transferred to another school 2 years earlier. "I saw the documentary," it read, "and I cried. Not because I was proud, because I remembered the day you asked if you could be part of field day, and I told you no. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting the school from discomfort. I was wrong. You reminded me what courage really looks like. Thank you." Amina read it once, then again, and on the third reading, her hands stopped shaking, because this was what she had hoped for all along. Not applause, but reflection. Change, born from discomfort. That night, she said yes to the scholarship summit. Then she emailed the television producer with conditions. "I will appear on your program, but only if you also feature 3 other youth leaders who are doing this work." Her message was clear. The story was no longer just hers. At school, things had changed too, but in quieter, more meaningful ways. The hallway ramp had been rebuilt after years of uneven wear. The student council had added an accessibility officer to its structure. One of the lunch servers now signed basic greetings to a hearing-impaired student each day, even though no one had asked her to. And for the first time in school history, 2 students using mobility aids were elected to lead the planning committee for spring games. These were not headline moments. They were ordinary, and that made them revolutionary. One afternoon, Amina passed by the gym and heard someone calling her name. It was Coach Willis, the same man who had once told her to jog a little, just for show. He looked different now, not just older, softer somehow. "You got a minute?" he asked. She nodded. Inside his office, he handed her a folder. "I am retiring at the end of the year," he said, "and I want you to see this before I go." Inside were forms, notes, diagrams, plans for an adaptive athletics program he had started drafting on his own. "I do not want this to be performative," he said quietly. "I want it to last." Amina stared at the papers. "You wrote all this?" He shrugged. "I listened, I watched, I changed. Took me longer than it should have, but I am here now." She looked up. "This is good," she said, "but you know I'm going to make edits." He grinned. "I am counting on it." They spent 2 weeks working on it together. Every afternoon, Amina brought notes, changed phrasing, adjusted categories. She added a mentorship model. He suggested partnerships with local universities. They argued once over budget estimates, but then they solved it over vending machine coffee and agreed that their differences made the proposal stronger. The final draft was submitted to the school board under both their names. That night, Coach Willis told her, "You turned a race into a revolution." "I just followed the lane you cleared." She went home and cried, not from sadness, from release, because she had not known how much she still needed to hear that. Then came something unexpected. A new student arrived mid-year. Her name was Ava. She had recently moved from another state and used a powered wheelchair. On her first day, Amina noticed how isolated she looked, eating alone at lunch, hovering near group projects but never quite joining. It reminded Amina of herself years ago, before the race, before the voice. So she sat beside her in the cafeteria, introduced herself, and asked, What do you wish someone would just say to you already? Ava blinked. That I do not have to earn my place. Amina nodded. Then hear it from me. You already belong. They became friends, slowly. Ava joined the inclusive sports planning team. She suggested new game formats that no one had thought of, relay paths designed for different speeds, rolling obstacle courses that were about navigation, not time. She had never been asked to lead before, but now she was shaping entire events. One day, Jules leaned over to Amina in the middle of one of the meetings and said, "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" she asked. "Lighting fires in people." She looked across the room where Ava was explaining her design for a new team challenge. "She already had a flame," Amina whispered. "I just made sure the wind didn't blow it out." More letters came in, from schools across the state asking for templates, from teachers asking how to start their own inclusion councils, from parents who had seen their kids smile for the first time during a gym class. And yet, through it all, Amina stayed grounded. She still walked home some days in silence, still had mornings where her legs felt heavy and her chest too tight. She still had to breathe through moments when someone stared too long or when a teacher mispronounced her name even after 2 years. Change was not linear. Progress was not perfect. But now she had proof that it was possible, that it could grow, that it could be passed on. And in the middle of all that growth, she remembered something her mother said long ago. You do not owe the world your strength, but if you share it, let it plant something. And now, everywhere Amina looked, things were blooming. Spring returned with its usual rhythm, flowers pushing through the sidewalks, morning breezes soft and promising, and students counting down the days to the last bell of the year. But for Amina, the season carried something deeper. It marked 2 years since the race, 2 years since she had been called forward to entertain a crowd that expected her to fail, 2 years since she had rewritten the meaning of what it meant to show up. The anniversary came quietly. No announcements, no assemblies, just the sound of footsteps on pavement and a school that now ran differently because of the girl who once struggled to cross the track. She was in her final semester of high school now. College letters had started arriving, most of them from institutions that had seen the documentary, read the articles, heard the speeches. A few were from schools that had already started their own inclusive programs because of the frameworks she had written. She read each letter carefully, not looking for prestige, looking for commitment. She chose a college that had built an accessibility center into its campus planning, not as an afterthought, but from day one. A place where ramps were not retrofitted. They were expected. She had no desire to become a symbol on someone's brochure. She wanted to build, again, differently, better. The night she committed to her chosen school, her mother took her out for dinner. They sat in a small restaurant tucked away from the noise, drinking warm tea and watching the street lamps flicker on. "Are you scared?" her mother asked. Amina nodded. "A little, but not the same way I used to be." "Why?" "Because now I know fear doesn't stop me. It just rides beside me for a while." Her mother smiled. "Then let it ride, but do not let it lead." Amina looked down at her tea, steam curling in slow spirals. "I will not." That night, she returned home and pulled out her original race shoes, the ones she had nearly thrown away. She placed them on her shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of what had come from it. As the year drew to a close, one final surprise came her way. The school announced a new event, the Kareem Invitational. It would replace the traditional field day, not as a themed event, not as a moment of tribute, but as a permanent part of the school's athletic calendar, open to every student, designed with collaboration, inclusion, and leadership at its core. And most importantly, it would be student-led. Ava was chosen to organize the first year's event. When she told Amina, she nearly burst with pride. "You opened the door," she said. "Now let me walk through it." Amina had never cried in a school hallway before, but that day, she did. Not because of sadness or pressure, but because of the sheer beauty of knowing the work would outlive her time there. The day of the inaugural Kareem Invitational arrived with a clear sky and a wide-open field. Students filled the bleachers, families lined the walkways, banners fluttered. No one wore matching shirts or painted faces in team colors. Instead, they wore whatever made them feel powerful, Wheelchair decals, embroidered sleeves, walking shoes, hijabs, braces, and pride pins. Everyone belonged. Jules was there too, now volunteering as a coach in training. He handed out clipboards and smiled as someone shouted his name. Amina stood near the center of the field, watching Ava coordinate stations like a seasoned leader. A second-year student with speech disfluency was reading the announcements into the microphone. Another was timing the events using an adaptive device. Amina had not planned to run that day. She had told herself it was time to pass the baton, literally and metaphorically. But as the final event approached, a relay designed for mixed ability teams, she felt her hand lift. "Put me in," she told Ava. "You sure?" Amina smiled. "I never stopped being sure." She joined the lineup. Her teammates were a girl with a visual impairment, a boy recovering from surgery, and a sprinter who had chosen to compete without scoring points, just to experience the event. The whistle blew, and Amina ran. She did not lead this time. She followed, matched pace, supported the handoff, crossed the line with her team, and when she did, she looked to the stands. It was not about applause anymore. It never really was. It was about making space, and now that space was filled with laughter, with sweat, with breath, with people who no longer had to ask if they were allowed to be there. They already were, because one girl once refused to stop running.